Hi, everybody. So, what we want to talk about next is we want to talk about the actual Atlantic slave trade and some of the arguments, sort of more recent arguments about it and how it affected everything that came afterwards. As you can see, this is from another class that I did, Europe and the World. I'm not going to expect you guys to know the details from this whole thing. I just want to bring this up as sort of this overall argument. Take notes based on that. Don't copy down the PowerPoint exactly. I'll make the PowerPoint available, but honestly, this is more to get the general argument and just to see what you guys think about that. So this guy named Eric Williams. Eric Williams wrote this book in 1944 called Capitalism and Slavery. It's a fairly significant book in the whole argument about how we receive the argument about slavery today. He was also the first prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago back in 1962. So let me just break it down like this. And again, you don't need to know this backward and forward. It's just in general, the argument. So he's going to say, look, let's talk about how the British looked at slavery up till this point. So remember, the British were all over the world, and they were, for a while, the dominant slave traders, but they also are very much on this in the same way. So let me just break it down like this. The United States talks about, yes, we had slavery in our past. Yeah, that's an awful part of our chapter. But you know what's so great about the United States? What's so great about the United States is that we overcame that slavery. We got rid of slavery. Look how great America is. This is the argument that sort of goes. It's the sort of the narrative that sort of cleans up the history of the United States. Britain has the same exact thing. Britain, look, we did all this imperialism. We did all this slave trade. We were also the very first country, entity, to push against the slave trade. So the fact that we don't have slavery today is thanks to Britain. Does that clean up Britain's reputation? So again, the British historiography on slavery up to this point is that yes, Britain participated in slavery and the slave trade, but they also evolved through a humanitarian impulse to reject abolished slavery. All that stuff that you guys saw about John Wesley that you just read earlier is along those lines. And so then Britain actively worked to end slavery and the slave trade globally. Hooray for Britain. Again, that is the story that Britain tells itself about slavery, at least up until 1962. It still largely tells itself that story in the same way we still largely tell that positive story about America, but there's also more voices speaking out on the other side. So here's Williams' economic argument. Again, you don't need to know this perfectly. Just to understand what he's saying. He's going to say the British abolished slavery and the slave trade because it was no longer profitable. Not because they were good, not because of all those things we saw about Wesley, though I think Wesley was genuine in what he believed, and many Wesleyans were genuine in what they believed. But they could say that all day long. Why did Britain go that way? Britain was able to accept that because the slave trade was no longer profitable. In the early 19th century, boy, you really don't need to know this, free trade becomes the British motto, and so other countries need to stop using slaves as well. Slavery is not economically profitable in a free trade system, so since we're free trade now, everybody needs to stop trading slaves. So what Williams is going to say from this economic point of view, he's going to say abolitionists like Wesley, were hypocrites who were mouthpieces for the new industrial interests. The economic interests didn't want slavery anymore, and they sort of leaned on these arguments from the other side. So the main argument that Eric Williams is going to make is this. Economics drove what was believed to be right, not the reverse. It wasn't Wesley saying, let's stop trading slaves because it's wrong, and then that what led Britain to do that. Eric Williams is going to say the economics said it's no longer profitable to do this, and so Wesley's argument then gets adopted to sort of clean up that version. It's a sort of justification after the fact. All right, great. That's Eric Williams. Let's fast forward to Robert Drayton. He's going to write in 2002 this article called Collaboration of Labor, another one of those very famous articles that you may never read in your life, but it's good to hear what's going on in this argument. Once again, I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. You don't need to write this down and know it word for word. Just what's the gist of the argument. So here's how it breaks down. He's going to say this. The global integration, or what we might call globalization, Globalization that happens during this period from 1600 to 1850 rested on the backs of black slaves. That's going to be Drayton's argument. The whole reason that Europe, and especially the European imperial powers, become the dominant things that are going to be dominant in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 2000s, and even today, are because of the advantage they took of black slavery. So especially those slaves who shaped the sugar plantation system in Brazil and the Caribbean. Sugar becomes like the big thing. Globalization, again, just listen to me, don't write it down. The context in which labor, under various forms of compulsion, is allied across the planet towards meeting what one party it thinks it needs or wants. So, for example, the Europeans, once they discovered, they didn't discover sugar, but once Europeans had more disposable income and they could buy things, what did they want to buy? They wanted to buy things that tasted good, sugar, which means the demand of sugar goes way up. Sugar is incredibly labor intensive to get. And so 17th century in particular, Europeans need and want sugar. Sugar is incredibly valuable. It's incredibly expensive. So if I want to make money, if I'm a business person and I want to make money, I want to get in the sugar business. Sugar is very labor intensive. It can only be grown in certain areas that we would call pretty harsh regions in terms of weather and things like that. Add into that things like malaria and all that kind of stuff, and it makes it a very difficult thing. So it's going to be places like, again, Brazil, the Caribbean. These are going to be places that are very good to grow sugar in, but they are harsh climates to live in. The Europeans who want to make money off this, they're saying, okay, anybody here want to go work in those areas? Nobody wants to go work in those areas. And so what you end up is this labor shortage. The labor supply is never meets the demand. We always need more laborers. It's going to be hard to work there. Nobody wants to do it. It's grueling work. Your life expectancy goes way down. That gap then gets filled by slaves. There's this economic gap. The best way to solve this thing would be slavery. And that's what drives the whole slave system, at least in the 1600s. So we talked about the triangular trade, and this Atlantic, it shapes the whole thing. So from Europe to trade things to Africa to get slaves, that trades over here, largely for sugar, tobacco, cotton, that comes back here, and you get the triangular trade. British dominance from 18th century is really funded by this Atlantic trade. Slaves as a commodity and the slave trade is a huge part of the economy of Britain. The reason why Britain becomes the dominant power in the 1700s is going to be because of the slave trade and the economic benefits of that. Also sugar, which again is going to be a hugely valuable thing, which is also produced by slaves. Like, you can't have Britain become the dominant thing without slavery. The circularity of this economy, European traders are going to take materials and labor from outside Europe. And then they use this capital to fund the ability to do this more. So again, profit is driven by this, and that profit is then reinvested into this system, which is going to get more of this, and that's what ends up with the economic dominance of certain countries. It's going to be because of the slave trade. So on the one hand, if I'm living in Britain today, I can say, well, I never traded any slaves. But on the other hand, the economic successes of Britain that I'm enjoying today are all because of that. I can't get away from that point, and on and on. So what Drayton wants to say is, hold on, you guys have been talking about it all wrong. Usually when we talk about this, we talk about Europe expropriates wealth from the rest of the world, right? Slavery sucks. Europe went out and they took stuff from Africa. They took people from Africa. They took stuff from the Americas. They took stuff from all these places and expropriated, and that's bad. And what Drayton wants to say is, well, that's bad. That's true, but it's more than that. The system was constructed in such a way that tended and still tends to allocate to the West a disproportionate share of the power to command and consume resources. In other words, what was done here was not just that Europe took that stuff and then profited from it. It took that stuff and then built a system which allowed it to continue to take this stuff today and all the way through. And so even the system we have today, which we would say we hate slavery, we hate racism, we hate all this stuff, the system is constructed out of that and reinforces that, even though we don't talk about it like that. That's what Drayton has to say about this whole thing. Just a couple more slides here. Changes in the 19th century, and again, you can see if you agree with Drayton or not, whether there's a good argument there. By the 1820s, which is going to be after this class, but still, by the 1820s, Britain abolished slavery and the slave trade, meaning for itself. It only did it in Britain. It couldn't say to Spain, you can't do this anymore. It will do that, but for now, it just says, look, we're not going to do the slave trade anymore. We're not going to do slavery. Aren't we awesome? Thank you, John Wesley. Thank you, all you Christians. We're so advanced. We're super awesome. We're not doing the slavery thing anymore. But here's what happens, is cotton ends up, at least at the end of the 1700s and then big in the 1800s, cotton displaces sugar as the new valuable commodity. Sugar, great, all that things, but cotton becomes the money maker. And in Britain, the whole economy is built around turning cotton into clothing. Textile mills all over the place. This is going to be the dominant thing. And again, Britain's going to be the number one economy in the 1800s. And one of the reasons it's going to be based on this, you can't grow cotton, I don't think, in Britain. So where's Britain going to get this cotton from? So some of the places, U.S. sources use slaves. Now, here's what Britain can then argue. Britain can say, we don't use slavery. We don't like slavery. But then they end up trading for that cotton from the United States, which does use slavery. So then is Britain culpable for that slavery or not? Indian sources. So a lot of cotton came from India. Now, India didn't have slavery in the quote-unquote legal sense, but the systems that were in place in India looked like slavery. Everything about them was slavery except for what they were called. So Britain could end up claiming the high road, but still profit from all this. We're getting all this money. And, think about the United States today. You have a company like Apple, which says, we don't violate human rights abuses. But then do we expect Apple to buy stuff from places, like raw materials from places that also don't violate? Well, that's not them doing it. So they can say, well, we still don't violate human rights abuses. This is where it gets very complex, these supply chains. Last slide. The slavery economy's impact. So just to wrap up Drayton's argument, the slavery economy's impact did not end with abolition or decolonization. So abolition in the 1820s or early 1800s, again, for Britain, and then abolition is going to happen probably by the mid-1800s in many of the other places like the United States. Decolonization, which is going to be late 20th century. And essentially all these things which we say, look, out of humanity, they're becoming less, I'm trying to think of the best word, less racist, less xenophobic, less Eurocentric, all those sorts of things. But what Drayton's saying is, hold on, you guys are jumping the gun a little bit on this. The winners of the Atlantic slave system shaped the system to their liking. So as conditions changed, because they were the winners of the old system, they got to shape the next system. And they had no incentive to shape it in a way that was less profitable for them. So what he's going to say is the division of labor imperialism is still with us today, that we do the stuff that's profitable, Europe. They do the stuff that is the labor-intensive stuff, the third world. The system's endless quest for cheaper labor and the growing inequities of the wealth in the global system, where these are all connected to the slave trade that was happening in the 1600s, 1700s, and on. And so, again, what Drayton's going to argue is really the same thing that Eric Williams argued early on, that these humanitarian moral arguments that Wesley's making, that maybe we make sometimes, they followed the economic interest, not the other way around. That economics was what's driving this whole thing, and not so much our good intentions or our belief in right and wrong. Those tend to follow behind the economics. What you agree on, whether you agree with this or whether you think the Wesleyan sort of argument that you saw in the video and all that kind of stuff is really the thing driving this, that essentially we as humans became, I don't know, better way to say this, we became better, we've advanced, I don't know the right way to say that. The point is that slavery is still a dominant part of how we think about things today, even though we say we moved on from slavery. Like the way that the international system is structured, the way that national systems are structured, all these things, the fact that the United States is the wealthiest nation today is not separate from the fact that it was a slave state back in the past. So these are all the things that I kind of want you guys to think about. There's no right answer to them other than I don't want to think about them. So, that's it for today. Yeah, I'll see you guys on Friday. Bye.